wanted to speak on a subject that's important to me personally, and that is the subject of the child with special needs in Halachah. Speaking as a parent of a child with special needs. So the question that I began by I should text myself. I need that one. Right. And I'm speaking from my computer because it would have. They're about 40, so we will need to share a little bit.
I'll make more copies.
Okay. It would have cost me, I thought, $1.89 to print out per page for my presentation. All right. So I began by asking the question really of what are the rights and the obligations of the child who has special needs, the child who has some kind of a developmental delay or a cognitive impairment of some kind. These are the families in our congregations, in many cases our own families. And we're going to find out in just a moment that there are a number of areas of Jewish life from which people with developmental delay are exempted for various reasons. When it comes to children, though, well, first of all, what do children do halachically? They learn, and when they are no longer children, technically, they are called to Torah as bar mitzvah. So when we ask this question, we're really asking the question of, do children who have special needs have the right in Judaism to have a Jewish education? Do they have the right to be called to the Torah as a bar mitzvah? To our modern mind, the answer is obvious. Of course they do. Of course we should be as inclusive as possible. But the answers are not quite so clear in the halachic literature. Part of the reason is something that Dr. Wachowski mentioned at the very outset, which is the whole question of rights is muddy, is interesting in Jewish law, because as we know, Jewish law thinks in terms of obligations, of chovah, rather than in terms of rights. That doesn't mean, I was going to go and quote the Declaration of Independence to show how our legal system is based on rights, where the Jewish system is based on the obligation, but you know the Declaration of Independence, so I don't need to do that. It doesn't mean, however, that there isn't a concept of rights in Judaism. And here I'm quoting from Chaim Cohen, the great Israeli jurist and Supreme Court justice, who writes that in the Jewish legal system, rights can often be inferred from obligations. He says prohibitions such as thou shalt not steal, for example, may be read to imply a right to possession and property. Similarly, the duty of learning and teaching is reiterated several times, but there is no right to education articulated anywhere. So in other words, where the Jewish system, where the halachic system assigns a responsibility, an obligation to a person to participate in something, we then can infer a corollary right to be included in that thing. So that's one thing by way of background. The second matter by way of background, and here we'll turn to the texts that are in front of you, is the question of those people who are exempted from certain matters of Jewish ritual and life for reasons of disability. So in the Talmud in Tractate Chagiga, it gives us a listing of 3 and actually many more categories of people who are exempt. Hakol, I'm in the first text. It says, Hakol chayavim b'ra'iyah. All are bound to appear at the temple, at the regalim, chutz mi, except for the cheresh, shoteh, the katan. Except for a person who's deaf, a shoteh, which we'll define in just a moment, and a minor. The child, we know why they're not obligated in the mitzvot. The deaf person is an interesting case that I can't get into right now, but it has very much to do with the fact that in Talmudic times, deaf people didn't have access to education or even language in many cases, and so they were not considered capable of participating in these rituals. And of course, the Jewish question, the halakhic question, is not, is he or she entitled, but rather, is he or she capable? And if a person is not capable, then they're often exempted, i.e. excluded from that thing. The third person or category, other than all of the other ones in the second half of the passage, is the shoteh. What is the shoteh? A shoteh is a person of questionable mental or emotional capacity. The Talmud in this next passage defines this person as someone whose strange or illogical actions draw their mental fitness into question. So it says, Tanu Rabbanan, Ezehu Shoteh. The rabbis taught, who is it that is deemed a Shoteh? And they have three different actions that might make us think someone is a Shoteh, is of questionable mental or emotional capacity. One who goes out alone at night, one who spends a night in a cemetery, and one who tears their garments. These are people who do these things at apparently irrational times or in apparently irrational ways. And there's a lot of debate about whether the definition is exclusive or inclusive. That is, do you have to do all three of those things to be deemed a shoteh? Or if you only do one of those things, are you deemed a shoteh? And in the Talmud, at least, there's no resolution to that question. So Rashi goes on then to tell us that it's not only from appearing at the temple, but actually from the entire mitzvah system that the shoteh is exempted. Ezehu shoteh, he writes, Ha'amor b'chol makom shepatur min ha'mitzvot min ha'onesh, ve'en kinyano kinyan, ve'en min karo min kar. Who is a shoteh? Someone about whom it is said that in any case, he or she is exempt from the mitzvot and from punishment for failure to follow them. Their purchases are not legally considered as purchases, and their sales are not legally considered as sales. So here you have a category of people who, for cognitive or emotional reasons, are exempted from the mitzvot, and therefore excluded from the mitzvot. Now the Talmud apparently includes both what we would call people who are mentally ill and what we would call people who are developmentally delayed in this category of shoteh. But by the time of the Rambam, there's already a division in between two categories, where he's introduced the category of what he calls the petty, which is a Hebrew word for which is a biblical word for simple, as being the person who is cognitively impaired, as opposed to someone who's mentally ill, who suffers from some kind of psychosis or something like that. And he writes down at the bottom of page 2 that someone who is a petit bayoter, someone, it's translated here as very feeble-witted, but we might say someone who is severely mentally retarded, is hare, this is the second line, hare kol elu bichlal hashotim. That person is considered to be among the category of shoteh, the exempted category of shoteh. So this already, the fact that there are two different words raises for us the possibility that there could be another type of petty, another type of a developmentally delayed person who is not fully exempted from the mitzvot. So now that's second thing by way of background. Now turning to the question of children, developmentally delayed children. Now it's interesting that the person that we're talking about here actually has in many ways the status of a child in Halachah. That is, they're not responsible for the mitzvot. They are not trusted when it comes to public transactions like commerce or like witnessing a legal document, and the Rambam gets into that as well. And they can't take on shlichut, that is, they can't be halakhically responsible for other people's mitzvot. They can't blow shofar in a service. They can't lead a Pesach Seder, because if they're not responsible, then they can't fulfill our responsible. They can't make the rest of us yotzei. So when it comes to actual children who exhibit developmental delays, that's very hard to say 30 times in 5 minutes, there is a real question about whether they are to be included when it comes to questions of Jewish education, when it comes to participation in the ritual, we would call the ritual of bar and bat mitzvah. What we see when we look at the modern halakhic literature is that in the last half century or so, almost all of the poskim, at least the ones I've found, across all movements, have looked for ways to be as inclusive as possible, drawing on these two categories and the difference between them in order to include children who have developmental delays in these matters of Jewish law. Now, in the Orthodox world, one of the definitive statements comes from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, a name that we all know. Feinstein, and here I'm at the top of page 3, draws that distinction between these two categories of people. He writes, Hine vadai ika chiluk ben shoteh uben peti bayoter. There is most definitely a difference, he says, between the category of shoteh and the category of peti bayoter, the severely cognitively impaired person. sheshoteh lo talui b'kishronot havadat dvarim v'inyanim. Because a shoteh, someone who suffers from mental illness, well, that's not dependent on the ability to understand things, that definition. That is, and he goes on to Av bali kisharon lavin dvarim efshar shedatam tehem meshubeshet u'meturefet. Because even someone who has the ability to understand the world around them can have can have an emotional state that can be disrupted or impaired. About petty, but a petty is someone whose cognitive level is lowered. And I'm just going to read the last couple words. And he goes on to say, and there can be a whole number of levels of this. But this level, the person's cognitive ability is fixed. That is, unlike someone who may suffer from psychosis or schizophrenia or something like that, they don't go in and out of it. And this we know, of course, that you can essentially, by the time a person grows up, you have a sense of what their cognitive ability is going to be. Vehine, and therefore, in the second paragraph, Shabadai chayavim b'mitzvot. Therefore, they most certainly are responsible for the mitzvot. She'eviu sarot, vehem b'nei yud gimel u'banot yud bet. When they reach the age of majority, that is 13 or 12, v'yesh chiyuv al ha'avot l'lamdam ma'ashev shar lahem. And therefore, there is a responsibility, in fact, on their fathers or their parents in our context, to give them a proper Jewish education. He then goes on to make a whole bunch of salient points that I won't read for you right now about the education of developmentally delayed children. He says, for example, that they don't necessarily need to begin their education at age 6, like is traditional for neurotypical children. He says that their curriculum should be, quote, what is appropriate for them to know. That is, a parent needs to know their child and needs to teach them in a way that will be accessible for the child. And finally, they generally require a smaller class size, says Rabbi Feinstein, than neurotypical children. And then he goes into a discussion about the need to pay. Who's going to pay for this smaller class size, asks Rabbi Feinstein. Because we all know that a class of 25 children isn't going to work. I know this personally, and many of you all do as well. Isn't going to work for your developmentally delayed child or your child with autism or Asperger's or something like that. So who's going to pay for it? Well, he goes back into the Talmud, Bava Batra 21a, which you don't have in front of you, sorry, to show that there is a community obligation to pay for education for children at a level of 25 students per teacher. In a case where you need more, he says, I'm in the last paragraph of Feinstein, Mistaber lo shayach chalek, ve'ikach yu liten mima'ot tzedakah gama kol hotzaot milchedet, hotza'ah milchedet ma shetzrichim. It doesn't seem right to make a distinction, and therefore we should pay for any educational, from the tzedakah coffers, for the educational needs of the special needs children as well, with the caveat that the education of neurotypical children, he says, is to be prioritized above that of special needs children. So Feinstein gives us a situation in which, yes, children with special needs are to be educated. That is to be paid for by the community in most cases, unless there's a funding issue, which we know is all the time, unfortunately. And that these children have the opportunity then to grow up to participate in Jewish life and to grow up as productive and active members of society. So how do you say productive and active member of society in Hebrew? Bar mitzvah, right? That's what it means to be a bar mitzvah. We would beg to differ about our 13-year-olds in our congregations. But what does it mean to be a bar mitzvah? It means to be someone who takes on the responsibility of the mitzvot to become a productive and active member of society. So what about a child growing into an adult who's not ever going to be able to fully take on the responsibility of the mitzvot? Can they be called for an aliyah? I know I'm running short on time here, so I'm going to try to talk quickly. The first of the modern poskim to address this is actually Rabbi Solomon Frehoff in 1963. I'm at the bottom of page 3. He understands actually the traditional answer to be no. No, this child cannot be called as a bar mitzvah. And he does so based on an understanding that the child is in the category of shotah. I won't read the first paragraph. That the child is exempt. Now, it wasn't clear to me in my readings whether This is because he predates Feinstein's writings, and therefore that hadn't been fully clarified yet. Those who come after Feinstein will understand this child not to be a shoteh, and therefore not to be exempted, or whether he's simply taking a different understanding of the law. But either way, he says traditionally, no, they shouldn't be called for a bar mitzvah. But he's going to get around this by understanding the bar mitzvah ceremony as something symbolic. In the second paragraph, he says, all this according to the strict letter of the law. Nevertheless, even acknowledging that he cannot be made responsible for the mitzvos, there is some justification for permitting this child to participate in the ceremony. The whole bar mitzvah ceremony, he says, is only a custom, a minhag. The Talmud says clearly, and you have that text at the bottom of the page in the note, that all may be called up to the Torah, even a minor. The Shulchan Aruch adds, that is, provided he knows to whom the benedictions are addressed. So if this child has enough intelligence to learn the blessings and to understand that they are addressed to God, then he may be called up to the Torah at any time. The next line says, so why not then on the Shabbat following his 13th birthday? Why not call this child? He gives his heter, so to speak, to the bar mitzvah based on his understanding that the bar mitzvah ceremony actually has very little to do with whether a person is responsible for the mitzvot. Rabbi Reuven Hammer of the conservative and the Masorti movement in Israel actually takes issue with that. He calls Freehawk to task for having put this child into the category of shoteh at all, but says instead that because his understanding based on Feinstein is that the developmentally delayed child is responsible for the mitzvot, therefore that child can and should be called to the Torah. And I'll read just the last line of this on page 4. Anu matirin et hatekes, in quotes, al smach kviyah hilchatich shamafager hu ken bar chiyuv. So we allow the tekes, the ceremony, based on a halachic ruling that this child is in fact bar chiyuv, is responsible for the mitzvot, kol odhu bar dat, as long as he or she is of a basic minimum cognitive capacity. Therefore, this person is responsible for all the mitzvot. And he or she is entitled, a modern word there, entitled to be called to the Torah, just like any other child who arrives at the age of mitzvah. This is what you find in Orthodoxy as well. Rabbi Yuval Charlo, who's a modern Orthodox rabbi in Israel, following Feinstein, rules similarly that a developmentally delayed child should and can be called to the Torah as a bar mitzvah. One final point, and then I will wrap up, and that's a point about the role of the community, which I think is going to show us a little bit of an evolution in thinking, if not an evolution in approach. So Rabbi Yuval Charlo points out, and all the rabbis in fact point out, that the child to be called to the Torah needs to be bar da'at. They need to be of a basic cognitive ability. They can have an understanding of what's going on. That has two parts. Part number one, they need to have the understanding of what are called potot, of verbal children, typical children of age 6 or 7. That's the cognitive level we need to be talking about here. And number two, they need to have some sense of God's involvement in the bar mitzvah. That in and of itself points again to an obligation by the community to provide education. But Rabbi Charlo is going to go further to say that's not the end of the community's obligation. It is in fact the beginning of the community's obligation. He's going to quote Rabbi Feinstein again to say that the community needs to not only provide an education, but also show the utmost of respect and inclusion to this child by greeting them with a kind face, by including them in prayer and in services, making sure that they know when to say Amen, they know when to reply Yehei Shmei Rabbah. And it says by showing what he calls revishut kfula, double compassion for the child and for their parents. I'm in the bottom of the bottom paragraph, about midway through where it said hadachaf, the third line. Hadachaf leipatchutam talui b'midah rabah b'imun shel hachevra b'cholatam leipatach. The impulse for these children's development is dependent in large part on society's faith in their ability to develop. Thus, he continues, the community, in its support of the child and the child's inclusion in community activity, has the privilege of taking part not only in an act of gemilut chesed, but rather in taking part in the child's spiritual and intellectual development. So quick conclusions. In Reform Judaism, inclusion is a mitzvah. It says so in our halakhic literature. In our response to literature in 1992, we wrote, "We deal here with a mitzvah and include it under the obligations we have with regard to our fellow human beings." Only the Reform movement is willing to stand up and say it's a mitzvah to include. But even, and equally remarkably, in the other movements as well, we see a sense of obligation to include special needs children in matters of education and in ceremonies like bar mitzvah as much as possible. Now, the Orthodox would, of course, argue that this is based on traditional categories and following the Rambam, but I think to our liberal eye, we can see an evolution in approach. An evolution in approach from what was once a matter of tzedakah, an act of chesed, an act of pity by the more fortunate to the less fortunate, to what now has become a recognition of the power that the community has in helping the child develop. That the more included the child is, so writes Rabbi Charlo, the more successful the child will be, and in fact, the better off society will be. This, I think, is an evolution away from just a matter of tzedakah. We'll do what's right, we'll take care of basic rights, and toward a much more mature understanding of what inclusion means in the halachic community. This, of course, will continue to be important. Diagnoses of autism and other developmental disabilities have, at this moment, reached an all-time high in our society, even as children of this type are achieving at higher levels than ever possible. And so understanding that we have an obligation as a Jewish community to include children with special needs, we have the ability to continue to open doors, to continue to provide education, and to continue to empower these children to the best of their abilities. Thank you.
There are some special privileges